Who was Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings? You're not going to get an answer out of this video, but what I do want to do is talk a bit about some of the theories that are presented about him. I think it's a well theorized, discussed matter, and I've been mulling. I have often considered about whether or not to bother with this video, but I think looking at the theories and looking at the ways, the kind of evidence they adduce and what they tell us about how Tolkien thought and maybe about how we think is interesting. So we'll see how this goes. I make, let's say, 4 main theories about Tom Bombadil. You know, because he's this weird character in Lord of the Rings. He turns up, he takes up 3 chapters or large parts of 3 chapters. He's a big diversion from the main plot, apparently, at least. We'll talk about that. He is unadaptable, allegedly, and I sympathise with that view. You know, he's not in the Peter Jackson films, and at least in part that's because how do you get this figure onto screen? How do you make it not ridiculous or weird? He's disliked by some people incorrectly. He's not explained. He doesn't fit into anything. There's not a note in the Silmarillion saying, and then Tom Bombadil turned up. So who is he? What is he? It's an interesting question, and it's one that Tolkien, in letters, highlighted the intentional difficulty of. He's created by Tolkien in the 30s in a poem. He is resurrected into the text of the Lord of the Rings. The poem and the kind of collection of poems he's interested in trying to get published, there's no interest in, so he adopts Tom into Lord of the Rings, and he brings him back again in the 60s when his aunt, I think, asks him for, you know, couldn't you write a lovely little book for people who like The Hobbit? It's kind of a similar thing, and he writes The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is a collection of poems which you can now get in Tales from the Perilous Realm or on its own. It has a Pauline Baynes illustration. My edition is Alan Lee, but the original illustration is Pauline Baynes. So if you like Pauline Baynes, it's a good place to go. It's The Adventures of Tom Bombadil as a set of poems is interesting. 1, because there is a fantastic reading by Tolkien of the title poem, and 2, because he added a new poem for it called Bombadil Goes Boating, which, if you want stuff to screw up your theories about Tom Bombadil, is perfect. So let's go through these big theories. Sorry, five theories. 1, he is in some way God. He's Eru Ilúvatar. So that's a big claim, obviously. You know, it's something which would radically change your understanding of Tolkien's world and how God fits into it. But there's one line which actually strongly supports this. Very specifically, one line. If I can find it, that will be better than me guessing. I mean, there's yes. Who is Tom Bombadil? Frodo asks. He is, said Goldberry. Separately, there's a comment on, you know, he is his name. This should make us think of the Hebrew name of God, which can be translated as I am who I am, or I'm doing what I'm doing. Jesus uses this line in the Gospel of John to express an identity with the divine. He uses the name of God in conversation to show his identity with the divine. And so maybe this is a sign that Tom is Eru Ilúvatar in some way, like he's an incarnation. Now, we don't have a doctrine of the Trinity, or we don't have a doctrine of incarnation in Middle-earth. How this fits in with Tolkien's subcreation is hard to say. And it's also, it's a big leap from he's in a poem written based off one of his kids' dolls, weird Dutch doll, and then he's God. Oh well, I'll just put God in the story. It seems like there's a creative leap there and a sort of instinctive leap there, which doesn't feel Tolkienian and which would be right to be sceptical of. But we need better evidence than just, I don't like it. What is satisfying about it is it explains his weirdness. It explains this weird thing about his name, about the fact he's not tempted by the ring, that created things don't tempt him. It's satisfying because he's weird, and we want an explanation for weirdness, and the idea that it's supernatural matches that. But are we saying that God himself incarnate on earth in some way would, once everyone else had lost the War of the Ring, eventually go down with creation? Is it that God is so hapless in terms of his understanding of the world, as we see? Because Bombadil is not interested in that which is beyond his own land. It's a fair question, and it's one that, both with this sort of sense, it doesn't really gel with Tolkien's general style, and also it doesn't seem to make sense of Tom's character as someone who is a married man living by the old forest and wandering around singing a lot, and doesn't really know much about the world outside, has learnt a lot about the world where he is, but doesn't know lots of other stuff. So I think Ilúvatar is an interesting theory. It's got one strong point in its favour to do with the name, to do with the he is, but beyond that, weak. Second, he's Aulë, and in this theory, because the Ilúvatar one doesn't really explain who Goldberry is. If he's Aulë, who's the Forge god, the Forge archangel, then Goldberry can be Yavanna, the kind of nature archangel or goddess, and they are respectively the father of the dwarves and the mother of the Ents. And so this is satisfying because, well, there's two of them. It explains Goldberry too. It's nice because Goldberry is the River Woman's daughter, so there's something to do with the wood there. Tom is very interested in nature, and I guess Aulë is. And maybe they're in some sense avatars. I actually don't... The idea of them being in some senses avatars, though not directly expressed in Tolkien of any other, as far as I can tell, any other archangel, Valar. There's something which would be appealing about it because it's suitably within some of the traditions that Tolkien could have potentially drawn on. Not really his most native ones, but it could be. The problem with the Aulë and Yavanna thing is everything else. Tom is not he doesn't forge things. He's short, but he's not really dwarf-like. Goldberry is not a creature of the trees, but of the water, and has a mother. They don't do anything. Then what are the avatars of Aulë and Yavanna for? And in what way does this connect to Bombadil's sui generis reaction to the ring, and the way in which he is connected to nature? Simply, the Aulë and Yavanna thing, though it has an appealing explanation of the pair of them, has no real details to recommend it. The third one, which is, I think this is actually quite a strong theory, is that, of all things, Tom is the music of the Ainur. I'll put a link to a blog. Some guy made like a 12-part blog, all posted on January the 9th, 2013, to explain all this. And it's come up several times since that I've seen. I don't know if I think he's the originator, or she is. But the idea basically is that Tom is the spirit of the music of the Ainur. And this explains his musicality. Music in Tolkien generally represents order, God's plan, Eru's plan. I made a video on the poetry in Lord of the Rings as this. Basically, essentially invariably, verse is associated with order and hope. And the music of the Ainur is, even with the discord of Melkor woven into it and made into something better, is God's plan for creation. And so in this theory, Tom is the embodiment of the music. In the earth, there has to be almost like I'm trying to think, it just escaping me, but almost like the representation of the world itself within the world, that trope and fantasy of the unicorn that turns out to be a portal into another world, that kind of weird stuff that you get in a certain kind of fairy fantasy, typically quite British fantasy idea. And I think there's something appealing there. There's some other reasons I think it's appealing, but I think it's appealing just because it explains the musicality, it explains why Tom is there. There's some good extra evidence, and you can read it all in detail, but there's stuff like, well, we're told there might be other powers in Middle-earth about as powerful as the Valar. We're told there might be orders of spirit who are not Valar and Maiar. If this is the case, could there not be one which is on its own sui generis thing? And in that case, that actually fits fine. Goldberry is not a mystery there, because Goldberry can be, as I think the most convincing theory has it comfortably, a nymph, some sort of other spirit. The problem there is not the nymph issue, because I think Goldberry being a nymph is quite compelling. I've made a video about this. My most popular Tolkien trivia, actually. Still only about 80 of you have watched it. But the thing is, the problem with Tom is trying to work out who this very different figure is. And if he's a spirit, the idea that in a sense he is almost a spirit on a level with Manwë in terms of significance, but with a very different role. Rather than being a governor, he is the land, and the land is him. He is, and this also explains some of those things in which he is almost royal. The fact that in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, the animals all listen to him; they just do what he wants. Similarly, in Boating with Bombadil, which has a very different jam for a while, it becomes pretty clear, at the beginning and at the end, it's pretty clear what Bombadil is, this supernatural power of the land. If he is the genius locum of the land, and of the land meaning ultimately all of Middle Earth, but particularly with this, because it has to be local, to be connected to everything, you have to have a somewhere. To be everywhere, you have to have a somewhere. And if there is a somewhere, that is that place by the Withywindle. All of this is attractive, and I think you could have it also help explain why Tom is a figure of virtue, and I'll get to that in a second. You could have it explain why he is immune to the ring, why he is not interested in politics, because he is the of all things, this is the weirdest thing that's come to mind. He is like the Will in Garth Nix's eventually interesting but eventually disappointing Keys to the Kingdom series, like a middle grade series. He's this incarnation of the land itself, or of the idea of the land itself, of the purpose of the creator, and hence why he falls with Middle Earth as well. Perhaps, if that is the case. I mean, then again, the music of the Ainur. This is the problem. It feels like it is not a Planet Narnia thing where you realise, no, it's just true. It is something which is attractive, but is very hard to make account for everything it would need to. It's one of those. There's lots of good things that seem to go in its favour, but ultimately, it can only be a speculation. An example: if he is the spirit of the land, and if the land falls because of its final conquest, if Eru and the Valar give it over for lost, the whole of Middle Earth given over to dark forces, which is not clear as that would even be the case, but let's say it was, then the spirit falls. Except the music of the Ainur also includes the Ainur, and it includes the elves in Aman. So presumably Tom would just have to move. It doesn't really make sense of that. It doesn't make sense of his peculiar characteristics. By that I mean his personality. He is, in Lewisian terms, he's a jovial figure, and which is why he's royal as well, as I say. But he is not, in all respects, what you would imagine of, if we're simply talking about an incarnation of the entire plan of the God in Middle Earth. It seems like, and that's something which is obviously coming from the previous poem, but again, it feels like much like you'd be forcing Ilúvatar on top of the previous poem, you'd be forcing this idea of it being the spirit of the music of the Ainur, and not accounting for who the character in that poem is. Or again, this is like Boating with Bombadil helpfully messes up lots of these things, because of all things, this is the oddest thing in it. I think that he goes along, and he. One of the things he does, he says, "Oh, I'm going to go somewhere," and he decides to go boating, and all the animals harass him and annoy him, but he's kind of having fun. And he does say, "Oh, I could go other ways, but I'll go boating to go here." And then he ends up in the Shire, and he goes and talks to Farmer Maggot for a night, and he talks about. Queer tale from Barrow Downs to Tower Hills, of walkings and of ridings, of wheat ear and barley corn, of sowing and of reaping, queer tales from Bree and talk at smithy mill and sheeping, rumours in the whispering trees, south winds in the larches, tall watchers by the ford, shadows on the marches. And then he disappears, and he doesn't go via his boat. He goes another way. So he either walks or he bombadils. And eventually the animals who have been mocking him come and escort his boat in state, albeit forgetting his oars, all the way back to where he comes from. So, I mean, it's an odd story again, but the fact that and this he wrote in 1962, so it's something which is neither contemporary with writing with the original adventures from the mid-30s, nor with the Fellowship of the Ring. This is another thing, and this is a way of tying things together. It's a very explicitly Lord of the Ringsian part of Tom Bombadil. But if you accept that as part of the same canon, which Tolkien does because he makes the Adventures of Tom Bombadil part of from the Red Book. They are Shire adaptations of either local or foreign songs and tales. And so in this case, you've got the music of the Ainur, or if you want Aulë or God, going for a wander to go and talk to Farmer Maggot about weird people on the borders, which will eventually be touched on without it really kind of making complete sense of being, in terms of the chronology, I mean, not in terms of the writing, in Lord of the Rings. So presumably this happens just before Fellowship, because there are, riders, there are watchers. So Tom is going, and this also doesn't completely jam. And this is one thing that you're talking at a point where there must be a flexible conception of Bombadil, because it doesn't even seem to fully match the Bombadil of the Lord of the Rings, who doesn't go anywhere or know anything about anything. Though, of course, Gandalf does say at the end of Return of the King, I'm going to go and talk to him about some things because I'd like to know what he's learned. So maybe we're meant to think that even that presentation in Fellowship is only partial. But all of this to say that all these presentations, even the most convincing, at best are useful as ways of understanding Bombadil rather than an explanation of the literary phenomenon. Now, there is the fourth option is he's just an enigma, and he's just a weird thing. And there's a couple of letters on this, letter 153, I think it is. He says that basically he'd already written about Tom and he thought he'd stick him in as part of an adventure. And I'll touch on the literary purpose again in a second, but the idea that it's fun. It's a fun thing. And he also says, I think it's in that one, that even in this mythic age there are enigmas that no one can explain. He's intentionally a mystery. Letter 154, maybe 153, something like that. He talks 153, I think. He talks in more detail about the idea that, and this does connect to the literary purpose too, that Tom is a form of mastery that does not require to master anything else, and it doesn't do to over philosophize him. It doesn't philosophize him. He's intentionally a mystery. Now, this doesn't mean there isn't a conception in Tolkien's head. It means he doesn't want to reveal it. We have this with Planet Narnia, that Lewis, the only direct evidence of Planet Narnia in Lewis's lifetime, in terms of, by that I mean of him saying, I've got a conception, is I think there's one letter, and Michael Ward does talk about this in Planet Narnia, where he sort of hints elliptically at the idea that there might be sort of some, the way in which medieval allegory actually works, which is not this one-to-one way, the way in which that might apply to stories, the way in which he thinks about stuff in terms of writing. There's a few other very good bits of evidence for it from his own lifetime, but that's, more or less, it could be the same with Tolkien, that he doesn't want to reveal the whole prestige for Tom. Now this connects, and this forms a bridge to the literary purpose as well. But one thing with Tolkien is he discovers things as he writes. And I wonder, I've said there's this 1930s poem, there's the Lord of the Rings being written from the late 30s into particularly the 40s, Fellowship of the Ring, with this long section about Tom. And then there's this poem in the 60s, 1961 or so, it's written 1962, which retroactively fits in Tom in a fairy tale, in a popular song, not in official narrative, but nonetheless it's in the Red Book of Westmarch. Him visiting Farmer Maggot to pass news of things that are happening, and again being very mysterious and supernatural, because how does he get home? He disappears without anyone waking, and then he doesn't take the boat home. So what's going on with these things? Well, maybe part of it is that Tolkien is discovering, as he discovers elsewhere, as he wonders about the Blue Wizards. I'm thinking about other famous examples, as he wonders about the motives for different characters doing stuff. You see this happening in his rewrites of the Silmarillion, particularly the Big 50s rewrite, and also in the final notes, the final kind of partial rewrites and constructions in the late 60s. You see this in lots of places in Tolkien, that he's a discovery writer in the sense that he'll say, no, it can't be like this because the words don't work, the etymology doesn't work like that, or that's a common thing to do with naming, because he worries a lot about names. You see this actually with, I think is it Amrod and Amras are the examples where he changes where they die or what's happening several times because he is discovering history. He's thinking, Tolkien is a good example of the kind of writer who says the characters just did this. Not that he puts exactly like that, but in terms of how he discovers things and wonders, well, maybe it was like this, or it must have been like this. And I wonder whether you see with Bombadil an evolution, much like you see the Noldo of the Book of Lost Tales turning into the Noldor, into Galadriel having a magic mirror and a magic ring and being tempted by another magic ring, all the way up to that, and Elrond at the Battle of the Last Alliance, from these wartime notebooks. Perhaps you suddenly see Bombadil evolving, and because Tolkien, apart from what was officially published, which was very little of his writing, he always sees things as up for grabs. And remember, when I say what's not published, he revises The Hobbit after it's been printed to make it cohere better with Lord of the Rings. So there's this ongoing elastic canonicity within his work. I think he would reject an external kind of alteration of that, but internally he's constantly discovering more about this fantasy world he has. And so Bombadil is readapted in from this outside poem. He's discovered to be part of Middle-earth. And he's discovered to be a certain kind of character via those three texts, those three phases. There is one other poem which is a rewrite of a different poem which he didn't publish in his lifetime. It's in the expanded version of Adventures of Tom Bombadil, 2014. So we can't see it in the same canonical way, or mostly canonical way. We must see it more like Silmarillion drafts and redrafts in History of Middle-earth. But there, Tom finds that the only things that won't talk to him are these things that he thinks are fairies from the moon. So this strange extra, and again, we're talking about, yes, it's a Red March fairy tale. You don't have to think of it as an actual historical story within Middle-earth. But it's an interesting idea that in that Tom is, again, there's another phase of Thomism where, I don't mean philosophy and theology following Thomas Aquinas, but of Bombadilism, where he is of a separate order to the fairies from the moon, even though he himself is plainly supernatural. So maybe part of this enigma is it's an enigma Tolkien was discovering as he wrote. Finally, Bombadil is a literary construct. Now, in one way, I should say, Tom Bombadil is categorically a literary construct. He's in the book as literary construct. Some of those things I think are fairly easily ascertainable and discoverable and thinkable. So what I more mean is Tom inserted chiefly as a sort of odd literary construct? And I'm inspired to this by, whilst I was thinking about this video, I watched a very, very recent video by a channel called Part-Time Hobbit, who much more impressive channel than mine. I will link that in the comments. And she is talking, she's kind of giving some coverage of who Tom Bombadil is and what his purpose is. And she offers the sense, and it kind of connects to what I've said about some of the enigma stuff. He might be an enigma. Also, he is a character from the poem. And she has an interesting idea that really it's Tolkien breaking the action so that in a different subcreation, a separate subcreation, the hobbits can go and learn something and talk about something. I don't massively buy that, and I'll say why in a second. But it's very interesting. It's compelling because it tries to explain the weird way in which Tolkien structures that section. In an organic way. Tolkien is intentionally creating an Italo-Calvino style separate sub-universe or set of universes and messing around with them so that he can accomplish, and you see Gene Wolfe do this too, but so that he can communicate some central points. Now, I do think he uses the Bombadil section to communicate some important points. I've talked about this in the video I made on Bombadil. The idea that Tom, and I've quoted the things that are said already in the letters, but also the fact that Tom is not master of anything. Goldberry says he's master of himself. He is not tempted by things. He does not need things. He is more real than the ring. And this is a massive Tolkien theme, that to only seek mastery of yourself makes you more real and more complete. To seek mastery over other things makes you thinner and less real. You see this with Maethros and Maglor, the noblest of the sons of Feanor, who, therefore, because they're the noblest, are longest tempted, longest reign, and are eventually driven to despair. You see this with Bilbo. You see this with Sauron, who is beautiful and able to do things, seems to repent perhaps, but then relapses and eventually is destroyed in the fall of Númenor, which makes him uglier. He's defeated at the Battle of the Last Alliance, which renders him more and more static. His desire for mastery over the world means he loses mastery of himself, and that mirrors his master Morgoth, who is similar, eventually becomes simply a fell figure who Fingolfin can fight outside Angband. So Tom is the opposite of that, and perhaps Tolkien thinks, when he says, oh, I thought I put a bit of an adventure in, that's one option. Maybe it's literary construct, just have fun. Maybe this wasn't seriously planned. Maybe he's doing what he accused Lewis of doing, mistakenly accused Lewis of doing with Father Christmas, just dumping stuff in, just saying, oh, this could be fun. Now, I don't buy that, neither do you. I don't buy it with Lewis, and I definitely don't buy it with Tolkien. I think what we see instead is, though it might be an interesting diversion, perhaps we see, as Part-Time Hobbit says, going into a separate subcreation, but I think rather this subcreation has been adopted into Middle-earth. But he does use this as a place where the hobbits are incompetent and can't do anything. They lose to a tree, they are told explicitly to be very careful about something, and then they get captured by, well, ghosts inhabiting corpses, which is a pretty scary thing, I grant, but nonetheless these are low-tier challenges, and Tom has to rescue them. It's a sort of first threshold in the hero's journey, and it's a chance for them to see a completely different way of approaching the problem. It is a mystical thing. And so in that sense, Part-Time Hobbit's theory appeals or attracts because it does actually compellingly explain that, the fact that that is the function of Bombadil. Now, I think Bombadil he goes to the Shire, he knows people, Gandalf can interact with him, he goes and hangs out in the Barrow Downs and knows the people who live there, and that goes back to Adventures of Tom Bombadil, in fact. So he is part of Middle-earth. I don't think he is, even in Tolkien, the back of Tolkien's head, part of a different universe being used as an exemplar. I think he's been adopted into Middle-earth, and I think perhaps the nearest thing you could say for certain is he is an enigma that Tolkien is working out. Perhaps he is some of these other things too. But I think I'm not sure ultimately even that very attractive literary construct theory works. None of these completely work. Some of them I think are more appealing than others. The fact that he is used by Tolkien to prove a particular point, absolutely. The fact that he's an enigma that Tolkien is, I think, working out over the course of a writing career, over 30 years, I think that's true. And maybe of all the others, and there are some other theories that float around, like is he another Valar or Maiar in disguise? Is he a genius Loki, Locum who is nothing to do with nothing to do with the music of the Ainur, but just is the Shire? So he's a particularly local genius Loki, possibly. You hear these different theories, but I think the most compelling of them is the music of the Ainur one, and it's because it connects to key themes to do with what Tom is and does, i.e. the sense of order, mastery via music, and the way in which that seems to be an incarnation of the land and of the health of the place, and hence why he can't stand apart from it. He falls of it, falls. Though I think it is a flawed theory that doesn't finally work, I think that's the most compelling of the others. And maybe you could glue some of these together. You could mix them and say the discovery that Tolkien is making ends up with a Bombadil who is like this. Ultimately, as I say, you haven't got the answer of who he is from that, but I hope you have at least found it interesting and found it helpful in your own quest. Tell me your theories in the comments. Till next time.